Didn't know what happened. Well, we're glad to see everybody. Hope you had a good afternoon. Hope everything went the way it's supposed to go. If not, just come on and we'll explain to you why it didn't. We are in the midst of a series of lessons on the Beatitudes, and tonight we're in Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Great, great thought. Because when you stop and think about what we've been talking about, we've been saying, and we'll bring this to kind of around at the end, but we understand that the word blessed means happy. But when we look at these qualities, these attitudes, if you want to call them that, we say, well, how in the world could the poor in spirit, how in the world could those that mourn be happy? But we understand happy to be a quality or state of the spirit the individual has. And we've talked about those. And so tonight, as we continue the series of lessons, we look at this idea of meekness, and we ask ourselves a question: what in the world is meekness? Define meekness, explain meekness. What do we think of when we think of meekness? Well, therein lies what we want to find out tonight. Because Jesus in this great sermon says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Who are the meek? What do we think of when we think of the word meekness? When we think of the word meekness, most times we think of somebody that is very timid, very shy, someone that is maybe quiet as a mouse, someone that maybe is relinquished by virtue of just willfully relinquished their rights, their privileges. They don't say anything. You get them in a committee meeting, they're quiet. You get them out in public, they're quiet. They don't want to say anything to anybody. They don't want to hurt anybody. They don't want to do anything from the standpoint of upsetting anybody. You don't know that they're there. That's the type of people that we think of when we think of meekness. We think of those individuals that really are just quiet and really don't say anything about anything. But the word quiet, or the word meek, has the idea of humble, but it has more the idea of gentle or mild. The individual that's gentle or the individual that's mild. But there's something in here that's a little deeper that we probably need to understand and we probably need to get. And that is, if you go back and you look at the word that Matthew used in this beatitude, has the idea of the taming of an animal. Take, for instance, a wild stallion. If you're going to take a wild stallion and you're going to convert that wild stallion from being wild to being one that is a useful animal, what do? Well, you capture the stallion and you put it out maybe in a very small arena area, pasture, and you leave it there for a little while. And then eventually you introduce people to that stallion. And then as you introduce people to that stallion, you then introduce the idea of a bridle possibly. And then you introduce, as you gradually work through the introduction of someone maybe getting close to the horse, maybe even getting on the stallion, and then eventually, of course, riding the stallion and breaking the spirit of the stallion from the standpoint of breaking the wildness of the stallion to the point where the stallion can be used. A saddle is put on the stallion. A bridle is able to be put on the stallion. And so the stallion then is able to be used as an animal, maybe even as a work animal, but as an animal to be ridden. That's the idea. The idea of that Jesus is saying, blessed are the meek. The meek are those that have a spirit that is tamed. They have, so to speak, been broken, but they are willing to be served, or to serve rather. They're willing to be an individual that, if you will, has had their spirit broken to the point of where they're willing to say, where God leads, I'm going to follow. What God tells me to do, I'm going to do. Where God shows me the way, I'm going to follow it. And so when we begin to think about it, we have to say, okay, we've got a definition, got a working definition. But does that mean that that person that has that broken spirit, that spirit that is willing to give in to God's way, does that mean that that individual doesn't say anything, doesn't have an opinion, an idea, a thought? No. Think about for a couple of examples. The first one being that of Moses. Moses was said to be the meekest man upon all the earth, right? Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3. Yet Moses killed a man. Moses seemed to be outspoken, and there were times in which, if you go back and read, when Moses was leading the children of Israel, he stood up against them. He had a strong power and sense of might about him, and yet said to be the meekest man in all the earth. But he had a spirit that was controlled by God. Now, when he killed man, admittedly, that spirit had to be changed. And meekness, we're going to say this now, meekness is really that which grows within us. It is that which develops. It takes time, the taming of the spirit. But then a second example would be that of Jesus. Remember in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. For I am" what? Meek. Yes, I am meek and lowly in heart. And Jesus was meek. But you know, when Jesus ran the money changers out of the table or out of the temple, when he made the whip out of cords and he turned the tables over, do you think that they thought he was very meek? Do you think that they thought he was very mild-mannered? You see, that's what we think of meekness. But we have to understand meekness a little differently. When Jesus stood up to the Pharisees, when he answered the Pharisees, Jesus was still a meek man. Another example that we could really throw in there is that of Paul. You know, we think of Paul being a great servant, and he was, and probably a very meek man. He was a man that followed God, and he gave up a lot for God. And in Acts 16, there's an interesting thought there where he is in jail. Remember, that's where he's singing in jail at midnight, and the jail opens, and the jailer comes in, and he's afraid for his life, and or that, you know, his life will be taken because he's lost his prisoners. And Paul, no, we're still here. And anyway, they decide, those in charge decide to let Paul go. Paul and Barnabas, just leave. And you remember what Paul says, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but he basically says, "Even. Why? Because you have openly condemned and beaten Roman citizens." Uh-oh. You see, he was not passive. Meekness we often think of as being passive. It's not being passive. It's that spirit that is controlled, that spirit that's tamed, that spirit that is willing to fit under what is now called, in a lot of circles, a paradigm. Now, I personally am not a big fan of that word. I went back to graduate school, and they started using the word paradigm. I started looking in my pocket for 2 dimes. But that's not what a paradigm is. Paradigm is sort of a structure, if you will, that this is where everything fits. It fits sort of in this outline, this structure, a paradigm. Well, when we think of meekness, we have to think of the paradigm of a spirit that is controlled by God, willing to listen to God, answerable to God, following God's will. And it includes a lot of different things. But one of the things that includes is a willingness to yield to the will of God. When we talk about being meek, we have to say that the individual is meek if they're willing to listen to, if they're willing to yield to God. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 39, Jesus makes the statement that those that will lose their life will find it, and he that finds his life shall lose it. That's the idea of meekness. I'm willing to yield to God. I'm willing to yield to what he has to say. I'm willing to fit with myself within the structure that God has given me, the paradigm, the structure. Well, where do we find that? Well, the Word of God. What God has told us to do, what God has shown us to lead our life. When God has said to do something, then we're willing to do it, and we try the very best that we can. I'll give you a couple of examples. How about anger? You know, James says that we're to be slow to anger. James 1, Paul said in Ephesians chapter 4, be angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. And Solomon, in the book of Proverbs says that a soft answer turns away wrath, and that we are to be slow to anger. The individual that is willing then to fit into God's structure, the individual that is meek of heart and mind and spirit, is the one that says, okay, this is an area in which maybe I myself need to structure my life, that I myself need to fit my life in, that I may need to work on it, that I may need to work on being individual that's a little bit less angry. And so we include ourselves in willing to yield to God, to do what God would have us to do, to follow God's will with regards to that issue. Or what about the tongue? We could use that as an example. James 3 reminds us that the tongue's a little member of boasts great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth. Makes sense, doesn't it? You can start a lot of problems with fire. You see, I told you right before church, Dallas Cowboys were down by 2 touchdowns. I had no clue. They're probably down by 3 now. No, I have no clue. I did look right after that, though, Jay. They were lucky. They were still 0-0. They hadn't been playing very long, though. But you can start a lot of little fires with your tongue. And you can not only start a lot of little fires, but you can say things. I was looking, I think it was this afternoon, through the headlines. I look through headlines a lot because I'll tell Suzanne, well, I noticed this in the headlines, or I noticed this, and she'll say, really? And what do you know about? Nothing. I read the headlines. But I read a headline, and it was talking about wanting me to watch one of the headlines for me, wanted me to watch a video. It said a explicitive rant-filled rave, and I thought, I don't want to listen to that mess. But profanity is not the art of the day, because it really takes no skill to use profanity. Jesus taught us that our language is to be pure. James taught us that as well in James 3. And so therein, the meek individual that's willing to tame his spirit says, I understand what God has laid down for the tongue. And I may not be perfect. I may not be the individual that is complete and has all the answers and able always to control my tongue, but I'm going to work on it, and I'm going to constantly work on it. That's what it means to be meek. I'm willing to yield to God's lead and follow his direction. So meekness put into action looks something like this. It's really when we're called by God and we follow God's will. In James chapter 1, James reminds us, beginning in verse 21, that we're to lay aside all filthiness and overflow of naughtiness. We're to receive the engrafted word. That we're to receive how? To receive with meekness. The engrafted word, which is able to save your soul. So what does James say? James is saying, you know what this word says? He says, you take it, and you take it to heart. You take it to heart. It's not a suggestion. It's not a thought. It's not an idea. It's not another good philosophy. It's not another good, read for the evening. He says, this is how you live your life. You base your decisions upon what God has told you to do. You live through temptation based on what God has told you to do. You remain faithful to God because this is what God's told you to do. That's the meek individual. It's the individual that's willing to do as God would have us to do. Jesus exemplified that. It had long been prophesied that Jesus would die on a cross. It had long been prophesied that Jesus would die the most excruciating of deaths. To die on a cross was something that the Romans had really perfected. Crucifixion by death really didn't occur till in between that 400 years, that intertestamental period between Old and New Testament. In that time frame, Rome took it and really took it from the Persians. The Persians sort of began the idea of crucifixion. The Romans took it and perfected it. It became an art to them. They knew how to crucify somebody. Jesus was condemned to die that way. Jesus, in his own meekness, do you remember what he prayed? He prayed, if there be any other way, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. When he allowed himself, if you will, to say, okay, I'm called by God to follow his will. I want to do what he says do. And so I'm willing to give up my life. And I'm willing to follow him. And so that meekness then is put in action towards God. In other words, we live our life towards God the way he would have us to live towards him. We would do the things that God would have us to do towards him. We would worship him. Jesus said, if any man comes after me, let him serve me. Oh, that's not an idea that is really, in this day and age, something people like to think about. We really, from a standpoint of society and society's norms, we want to do our own thing our own way. And it's really not up for discussion. The meek individual says, okay, I get it. I understand that towards God, I'm to be an individual that serves God. I do what God would have me to do. I defend his gospel. I stand for him. I do not like sin. I like righteousness. And I want to practice righteousness. I want to do what God would have me to do. And so the meek individual is not only meek towards God, he's meek towards men. What does that mean? He's willing to serve others. He's willing to roll up his sleeves and find out what he can do to help others. He's willing to teach the lost. He's willing to point the lost to Jesus. He's willing to go and do what he can to help bring unity in the brotherhood and in the world. He's willing to be at peace with his neighbor. He's willing to be the individual that looks like Jesus. We all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into his image. That's the meek individual. The meek individual is willing to say, okay, what can I do for my fellow man? You see, we often think, excuse me, we often think with regards to our relationship with God, am I praying enough? Am I reading the scriptures enough? Am I going to church enough? Am I doing those things? Am I worshiping enough? But we don't think about sin as having not only just that vertical relationship, but that horizontal relationship. That relationship with mankind. And it's both. Sin is violation, contradiction, probably is the best way of putting it, contradiction of sonship with God, brotherhood with mankind. It's when we break either one of those. But the meek individual says, okay, what can I do for my fellow man? How can I help them? How can I be of service to them? What can I do to them? You see, the servant of the Lord doesn't strive. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 24. He doesn't quarrel. He doesn't get in fights. He's not angry, but he's willing to be patient towards all. Titus chapter 3, verse 2, and being patient towards all, he's also willing to stand up for the truth. He's willing to be set for the defense of the gospel. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. The meek man understands that the lost are lost and is wanting to save them and willing to save them. And yes, they ultimately have to come to that decision on their own. But the meek man is one that's at least willing to try. And so, meekness to act, really when we act upon God's will, God's way, in God's time. But just like the previous Beatitudes, and like those that will follow, there are blessings. There's a blessing that comes. And notice what he says. He says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Now, some will take this, especially those that believe in premillennialism, and that's a whole different case and different issue for a different time. That this is talking about if a meek individual is meek, they'll eventually get to dwell upon the earth, and that these are the individuals that will dwell upon the earth for 1,000 years. That's not what this verse teaches. This verse is actually a quote from Psalm 37, verse 11, in which the psalmist says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth and shall delight themselves in the abundance of his grace. And if you go back to Psalm 37 and see the original thought around that verse, you find out that there are two, if you will, blessings. There's the enjoyment, first of all, of the present life, the here and now, this life. In other words, here's what Jesus says. The individual that's spirit is tamed, spirit is conforming to the will of God, they're going to enjoy this life. There are a lot of folks that would debate that. There are a lot of folks that would say, Christianity is no fun. There's no fun in Christianity. And you hear from time to time, you people, y'all can't have fun because you got to give up so much to be a Christian. You got to go to church. You got to live this way. You got to do this. You got to do that. It's no fun. But the psalmist reminds us that there's enjoyment in this life. There's a peace that passes all understanding. There's a hope that shapes and forms our life and gives us a reason for moving forward. There's a forgiveness that comes and allows us not only to forgive others, but allows us to forgive ourselves. If we feel and understand the forgiveness that God extends to us for the transgressions that we've committed. It's the enjoyment, if you will, of the present life, knowing the blessings that are found in Christ. Going to like Ephesians chapter 1 and reading of those spiritual blessings that as Paul talks about to the church of Colossae. But not only does the psalmist tell us that the meek shall inherit the earth with regards to enjoyment of the present life, but he also talks about the enjoyment of the home in heaven, of the future life. The invisible city that we talked about this morning that we have not yet made. But we know that the earth one day will be destroyed, according to 2 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 8. The heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. And all the things that are upon the earth, Peter says, will be burned up, be gone. You might say, well, I'm not looking forward to that. I'm not looking forward to the idea of the hereafter, but when you think about what is the hereafter, when you think about heaven, and you think about who's going to be there, and you think about what's going to be there, and you think about the fact that it's going to be eternal, and the fact, as we talked about, the no mores that will be there. I was reading last night a little article in which the author talked about things you did today that will not be in heaven. And it's kind of cute in many ways. He said, you probably took an aspirin today. You won't take an aspirin in heaven. You won't have to. You probably went by the drugstore today. You won't have to stop and go in the drugstore and get the drugs anymore that you're taking to keep going. You won't have to drive by or even eat in a restaurant that sells alcohol anymore. You won't have to go visit a friend, funeral home, and try to soothe them from the pain that they're suffering because of the loss of a loved one. And so he went through this list. And he made heaven sound so wonderful. You just wanted to go. You just wanted to be there. Well, the meek understand, because the psalmist tells us that there's the blessing of the enjoyment of what lies ahead. And so the meek shall inherit the earth. Meek, how do they fit in the Lord's overall picture of this sermon? Well, we look first of all at the idea of happy. Happy are the poor in spirit, those that are humble. Happy are those then that mourn. They have a contrite spirit. In other words, they're willing to be sorrowful for what they've committed. And the meek, who are submissive to the will of God. Now, interestingly, as some would break this down, we could almost draw a line right here. And we'll have to, because next week is Fifth Sunday, and so we'll skip a week and come back the first Sunday of February, pick up with this series. But when you look at it, here's what the psalmist, or excuse me, what the Lord is saying. You want to come to God? This is what it takes. Now, he'll move a little bit further and talk about the relationship with the Lord. But right now he says, you want to come to the Lord? Humble your spirit. Be sorry for the wrongs in your life and be willing to conform to my will. And happiness can be yours. So this evening, as you look at those things and think about those things, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation as he offers you, come to me. Won't you come? I'll stand and sing.